Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's class on foods that harm and foods that heal. So today's class I wanted to do because I get quite a lot of people who are in one camp who feel like there are a bunch of foods that they're eating that might be bothering their systems and they're not really 100% sure. And some of them might even have gone to their doctors or dermatologists and said, test me. And those tests have come back negative. And then there's another camp of people who actually have no idea that food is impacting their bodies and that they're having any symptoms. And they're probably not in this class, but there's some information that I'll be sharing that would be useful for them to make that connection. So a large part of the work that I do with my clients is on diet change, on nutrition, because food forms such a large part of what we're doing every day, for one, as well as driving a driver for inflammation in the body. Because this is something that we're doing multiple times a day, it's one of the highest impact changes that we can be doing that's going to be supporting our bodies and impacting our health in a positive manner. So like I said, this is a large part of the work that I do with my clients. And those that come to me who are already eating really clean diets, we kind of move on to more progressive work, which is to do with gut health. But so this class is really more for those who are in the early stages of really figuring out what foods might be bothering their systems. And the idea is that with the information that I'm sharing is giving you a pathway to figure out how you can find out what those foods are. So there are three kinds of ways that our bodies react to food. That would be food allergies, food sensitivities, and food intolerances. And there is a lot of confusion out there as to what is what and are they synonymous. And a lot of people are saying I'm lactose intolerant, and so where there might actually be, in addition, dairy intolerant, and it's not one and the same, and I'm going to explain why. Okay, so one of the main ways when we go to a doctor to test for foods is they're going to be testing for an immediate response to food, which is what we call an IgE response, an allergic response. And that is very often done with kind of prick tests or patch tests. I've had quite a lot of those done on my body because I initially had also believed that I was allergic to foods, and I came back positive really more for pollens and grasses than food itself. So this is quite a common thing that people go and they get tested for things that they don't, maybe they're positive for metals and pollens, but they're not positive for any foods. So the food allergy test, which is the IgE response, you would actually know if you ate the food that you have an allergic response, because it would be an immediate reaction. You would either feel like a closing in the throat or a tingling in the mouth, or somewhere else in the body you might get an immediate response soon after the eating the food. So that's a fairly easy way of determining things. It's not good, obviously, if you have a very hyperallergic system and that you go into anaphylactic shock. That's not recommended that you be eating the food just to test. So that's why the pinprick tests with your doctor are more recommended for food allergy. But we respond only like a small percentage on IgE. That's the immediate reaction in our immune systems. We respond on a much larger scale to food sensitivities. And that's what we term a delayed response to food. So that would be IgG antibodies and IgA antibodies. So these make up approximately 70 to 80% of our immune response to foods. And they're not often being tested by doctors, very often because they're saying that we're creating antibodies to foods all the time, which to some extent is true. Our immune systems are always testing, sampling, and deciding whether to react to something or not. But in functional medicine, we have special functional tests that can identify different grades of immune response to an IgG food response or an IgA food response. So these can be tested, and the way they break them down is kind of a red response, an orange response, a yellow response, or maybe a light green or green response where there's no real immune reaction. So that is one area of testing. And like I say, conventional doctors are not very big fans of IgG testing. And even in functional medicine, we might use IgG testing or other antibody testing like IgA. But our gold standard is really what we call an elimination diet, because we've seen that there a list of foods that most people respond to. We feel that it is easier to remove these foods for a period of time and then reintroduce these foods one at a time after your removal of a period of 1 to 3 months. And that is what we call the gold standard, because seeing how your body responds rather than just seeing it on a piece of paper is more indicative of an immune reaction. So I personally, and I know there are quite a lot of people who have this, that we don't have a very good body sense and aren't very good at identifying symptoms. So I tend to use a combination of elimination as well as testing. So I'm very much a data person, and I do like to see data. And I know there are a lot of people out there who like to see data. And for those people, then I would generally recommend a food sensitivity test. Now, there are quite a large amount of food sensitivity tests out there. And the one I tend to use is one where because most of the tests that are out there, as I've mentioned, do pick up antibody responses, which our body is responding to. But the test that I use uses something called the complement system as well. So you're using an IgG response as well as a complement response of the immune system. And with these two, if those are positive, then they'll put that on the list as saying that your body is responsive. And so that helps reduce the number of foods on your list that your body might be responding to, because it really is then an immune response that we're picking up and not just a small antibody response. So I'll explain the test that I use later, and I'll give you guys a link in an email, or you can message me as to the test that I use. But yeah, so there are, as I mentioned, quite a few different tests, and we also can test for IgA antibody responses. These tests are much more expensive because they're doing both IgA and IgG, and they're only picking up probably an additional 10% of your immune response. So I feel like using the IgG as well as the complement test, that we're getting probably 70-75% of your immune response, and that's for most people more than enough to get most of the foods that they're responding to. Good, so I've spoken about an immediate reaction, which is the IgE reaction, an allergy, and I've spoken about the delayed reaction, which is an IgG or IgA response. I call this a delayed reaction just so that you know, because you can be responding anything between 2 hours and 3 days. So anything between 2 hours and 72 hours, you can be responding to foods. And this is what makes it quite difficult for a lot of people to identify how they're responding, because they might be food journaling and not looking back 3 days, or not remembering what they ate 3 days ago and seeing the patterns. So I did a lot of food journaling and I could never find the patterns. Not that good that way. But so that's why I find that the tests in combination with some elimination diet is much more useful. I'm going to pull up a list of food sensitivity foods that can just highlight. So this is for people who don't believe that they have anything going with food sensitivities. This is just a list of common food sensitivities and the kinds of reactions we could be having. And this is not by no means a comprehensive list of reactions. This is just a handful of reactions that are common with food sensitivities. So if, regardless of whether you feel that food sensitivities or that food is an issue for you, if you just look at this list, you will see that if you have headaches and brain fog and low energy or joint pain, it's very likely that some of these symptoms that you're having could be linked to food sensitivities. And that's why I find it's a very key area to explore with many clients, either by doing some testing or by doing some form of elimination diet. And you'll see on the left here the list of very common food sensitivities, gluten and dairy being the top two, as well as things like eggs, soy, corn, nuts, mostly peanuts, shellfish, and beef and pork. So in elimination diets, we're taking out the usually these foods. So I've done several elimination diets, and there are many different types out there. Some of you might have heard of the most extreme, which is called the autoimmune the autoimmune protocol. And that one's taking out these foods as well as grains. And then you have things like the Institute of Functional Medicine recommended list, which is taking out pretty much this list here, maybe one or two differing items. And for those of you who've heard about my reboot, I'm taking out pretty much this list, as well as for 2 weeks, we're doing additionally grains. And I find that that helps the majority of people, even in the space of a short period of time, which is 4 to 6 weeks. With elimination diets, it is important that when you start to reintroduce foods, that you're doing it in a very methodical way. So not introducing all foods at once, but rather one food at a time, and monitoring your symptoms over a period of 2 to 3 days. Because as I mentioned, it's a delayed reaction. So you're looking for shifts in any of your symptoms, or looking for any changes in your body over a period of 2 to 3 days. Okay. And so the third area that I was going to talk about with regards to food, and this is a very common area, is food intolerances. And the most common one that a lot of us are aware of is lactose intolerance. And that's because 2/3 of the population are actually lactose intolerant. And in fact, I pretty much can say that all Asians are lactose intolerant. So if you're Asian, you probably should be going lactose free at least. With intolerances, this is more a body's deficiency in an enzyme. So for those who are lactose intolerant, you are deficient in the enzyme lactase that breaks down lactose. And so you would generally have some kind of response because your body cannot break down the food. And most common response for lactose intolerance is fast bowels or diarrhea. There are things like histamine intolerance that is more of a misnomer in terms of intolerances. We do have an enzyme that breaks down histamine, but it does not, having a histamine intolerance does not necessarily mean that you don't have the enzyme. It's very often a case of not producing enough of the enzyme, or that you have an overload of histamine symptoms because of immune reactions. So when we have immune reactions, very often our body produces histamine. And so it becomes quite an imbalance. We're producing quite a lot of histamine. We're unable to clear a lot of histamine. And so we get histamine intolerance symptoms. So excess histamine symptoms, which are very commonly itchy skin, itchy eyes, runny nose, kind of hay fever symptoms. Those are histamine reactions. Okay, so that is the difference between intolerances, allergies, and sensitivities. There are other areas that I wanted to highlight in this talk with regards to food and classes of food that we need to be aware of. I'm not going to talk about junk food because I think that's straightforward for everyone, that junk food is not good for our bodies. But I think a lot of areas where people are missing out on are things also that we're using every day, things like our cooking oils. For instance, my mom still uses very generic kind of sunflower cooking oil in a big 5-liter bottle. So refined sunflower oil, those are just not kinds of oils that you should be using because they're cheap. You need to be looking for good quality, non-chemically processed food. So mechanically processed oils, things like extra virgin olive oil. To cook, I very often use ghee, which is a clarified butter, and that takes out all dairy proteins, as well as coconut oil. So those are the oils that manage to resist high heat, and we should be staying away from refined vegetable oils like sunflower, even things like raps, which is canola oil. Other areas that we should be looking out for are foods that might be laden with hormones, pesticides, or antibiotics. So most often the hormones and antibiotics are found in our meats. And so we want to be really cognizant of choosing organically farmed meats, so to avoid the burden of the hormones or the antibiotics that they've been raised with. So anything that an animal has consumed or been injected with will be in its meat, and therefore it will be passed on to us when we ingest it. Pesticides, another issue. Pesticides being used everywhere, and so trying to choose organic fruits and vegetables would be the most sensible thing to avoid any burden. So there is a list on a group called EWG, the Environmental Working Group.org, EWG.org, where you can get a list of the clean 15 and the dirty dozen. These are the fruits and vegetables that are most commonly either burdened or needing pesticides to look good and to be able to be sold well. Things like apples and strawberries are very common on the dirty dozen list, spinach as well. So these are foods that you really should be trying to buy organic as far as possible. And then the clean 15, generally, if you're buying these foods non-organic, they're safer. Another area that we should look out for is heavy metals in food. So a lot of people, when they're trying to move towards a healthier diet, they might be switching from meat, maybe more to seafood. And seafood, we know, is also burdened to some extent by plastics, microplastics in the fish, as well as heavy metals. So the larger the fish, like a tuna or a swordfish, they tend to carry more heavy metals. So try stay away from eating too many large fishes. So I've really cut down my tuna. In fact, I hardly ever eat tuna now because of the heavy metal burden, and really try and stick to smaller fish, things like sardines, mackerel, anchovies, because these are less burdened by heavy metals. And one last area I'd just like to mention is sweeteners. Sugar in general. I think everyone has this kind of affinity for sweet things because of our natural response to try and survive. Our bodies have learned to like sweet things, but there's just a host of many different sweeteners. And so my recommendation in this area is to stay away from artificial sweeteners, anything like aspartame, acyl sulfame, sucralose. So people using things like Splenda, I can't even think of the names now, that often are being served in coffee shops to sweeten your coffees or teas. stay away from those, rather than just have a little bit of normal sugar if you have to have something sweet than these artificial sweeteners, because they do damage the gut lining and can cause other issues. If you are choosing natural sweeteners, then I would lean towards things that naturally occur in nature. Things like dates and date syrup is something that I would be using. I use for baking things like coconut sugar, but in general, the more natural you're going, the better for you. So if you're looking at honey and dates, those are the two most natural sources of sweetness. Okay, so that really covers what I wanted to be talking about today. The food sensitivities, food allergies, and food intolerances are a very important aspect, I'd say, of any work that somebody would be doing with a functional medicine practitioner. So I've signed up to the Institute for Functional Medicine, one of their early courses, and everybody that goes through the course needs to go through an elimination diet just to experience what it's like as a doctor or a practitioner, to be on the other side of the recommendations. And it's very clear that these kinds of elimination programs are not very easy. So for anyone that is considering trying to figure out what food issues they have, the choices are those. It's either doing testing, which is 70 to 75% good, or elimination diets. And so because elimination diets involve quite a lot of substitutions, a different kind of mindset, a different way of looking at how you feed yourself, I run group programs to support people through these changes. And so the Reboot was one kind of elimination diet, really hard and fast over 4 to 5 weeks, for those who feel like really strong about changes. And I'm considering doing something that is a little bit easier, a little bit more gradual in terms of the changes, say over a 6 to 8 week period of adjusting to an elimination diet and then doing an elimination for a minimum of 4 weeks. So that I would offer anyone that might be interested in doing that kind of thing. Testing you can also do through me. So as I mentioned, the test that I use is an IgG plus complement test through a company called KBMO. And so they have, you can Google KBMO food sensitivities, and they are a company out of the US, and they can send a little kit. All it is a pinprick lancet to the finger and 5 blood spots, and those you just send off back to the labs, and they'll send you results within about a month's time. And I find that in combination with some kind of elimination, gluten and dairy being the main two, has been very useful for many of my clients. The reason gluten and dairy are such big issues in the functional medicine world is because gluten on its own is a protein that causes our guts to become permeable, extra permeable for a period of time. So we all know that we have little gaps between the villi in our intestinal wall just to let through nutrients. But what happens is with leaky gut and intestinal permeability, that means big gaps, all undigested food proteins in our intestines come through, and that's what starts causing an immune response on the other side of our intestinal walls. So gluten just causes those gaps to widen and let through a lot more things. And so this is what's causing very often a response by our body, and very common in autoimmune disease. So gluten is a minimum for those struggling with autoimmune. And then dairy, because it is also a very similar looking protein, your body can mistake the dairy protein also. So if it's responding to gluten, it will very likely respond to the dairy protein. And dairy proteins are very difficult to digest as well. So as I mentioned, if you're going lactose free, that's not enough. Lactose-free is only taking out the sugar of dairy, whereas going dairy-free, you're taking out the casein, which is the protein as well. So you're going complete dairy-free means that you're taking out lactose and casein as well. And so lactose-free products are not on any elimination diet. They're completely out. Okay. Good. So I'll stop for questions. Okay, yeah, no, that's perfect. This is a good question. So yeah, what I didn't cover is foods that are really good for our bodies. And so you're right there, JB. So, okay, I'm going to just talk briefly about the macronutrients. So macro being the large groups of food that we need to be taking in every day. So we need to make sure that we're getting protein, or that we're getting fats, and that we're getting carbohydrates. Okay, so people who are avoiding animal protein need to be making sure that they're getting at least enough plant protein through beans and lentils and chickpeas, etc. Okay, so that's one aspect. The second aspect is making sure that you're getting enough antioxidants through lots of fruits and vegetables, because these are going to calm any inflammation in your body. They're providing lots of vitamins and minerals. So all the bright colors as much as possible. I recommend from 6 to 9 portions, which is fistfuls of fruits and vegetables per day, to really help reduce inflammation. Most people are only getting maybe 2 to 4 fistfuls of fruit and veg per day. So really aiming to increase that amount.
A lot of ginger, a lot of cinnamon, ginger, those kind of things.
Yeah. And then hydration is a big part as well. So we really need to make sure that we're hydrating our bodies well enough so that the water gets into our cells. So I always recommend hydrating with salt as well as electrolytes to make sure that the water, that we're not just drinking water and it's just passing through us and we end up peeing all day, that it actually gets into our cells. Yeah. Okay.
What on your water, what pH should you be drinking?
So the pH is usually around about 7, but I wouldn't be worried too much about the pH. Don't try and over-alkali the water necessarily. It's not important. We get the reduction in acid through our fruits and vegetables. So I'd prefer you to be getting more an alkali environment through lots of fruits and vegetables than trying to alkali your water. Okay. So your question, JB, was about alternatives for dairy. So if you're not going to be having dairy, what kind of alternatives can you have? And as you see on my list, that soy is quite a common food sensitivity. So I don't commonly recommend soy for people trying to move away from dairy milk. I do recommend nut milks, and there's any combination of nuts that you can have. Almond, cashews. Some people can tolerate oat milk, but I try and encourage them to look for gluten-free oats, because there is very much a cross-contamination with oats and gluten. So even though you can get gluten-free oats, so very often the oat milk is not gluten-free. So I discourage oat milk unless you can find ones that are gluten-free. There are also new on the market things like hemp milk. Yeah, so seed milks you can also consider. Obviously coconut milk, and if you like the taste and watered down coconut milk.
What's your view on magic mushrooms, or magic mushrooms that for inflammation and those kind of things?
Yeah, so there are different kinds of mushrooms for different kinds of things, and mushrooms are great anyway. They're quite a healing food. They're high in vitamin D, and they're also do have very medicinal properties. So there are different kinds of mushrooms for different kinds of purposes, and I would do a mix there. There are probably things like cordyceps and I think it's called lion's mane or something like that. But I'm not an expert on mushrooms, but I do know that the mushrooms have great medicinal value, and you could consider trying to use them to reduce inflammation. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think you've covered it very well, Morel.
Did I? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you did very well.
Oh, and one aspect as well, I think, especially in terms of gut health, things that we would like to include more in our diet are prebiotic foods. So for those who have, an imbalanced gut and are taking probiotics, you need to be feeding these probiotics with prebiotics. So prebiotic foods are things like chicory, cooled peas, cold potatoes. They're what we call resistant starch, and that generally feeds the bacteria quite nicely. And so including these foods in your diet as well. And also, if you're not sensitive to fermented foods, I support a lot of people with histamine issues, and their fermented foods might cause issues if they've still got a high histamine load. But in general, fermented foods are really good for gut diversity and introducing all of the good gut bacteria. So I use kombucha daily in my smoothies. I've used kefir and liquid water kefir in my smoothies as well. And then including things like kimchi or sauerkraut or any other fermented type food. We also need to help you figure out why your gut might be out of balance, right? So the work I do in my gut programs is top down. So from chewing to stomach digestion, which is usually where the issues are, that we're not digesting the food well enough. So we get too many undigested food proteins coming through, and these end up coming through the leaky gut, causing issues on the other side for our immune system. So yeah, I'm going to stop the recording.